All right. I hope everyone can hear me. Hello? Ben, I can hear from you.
Yeah,
Okay, all right. Okay, that's great. Oh, okay. All right. So we're going to continue from the last session where we ended. We are still on building the design that we have, the One Loop website landing page. And before I proceed with what we're going to do today, I mean, obviously, we're going to continue with styling the navigation bar. I think where we left off, we were able to implement the one loop text and then the navigation items. But we are still here to ensure that they're on the same line as we have over here. Currently, they're vertical. So we'll explore how to align them horizontally. But before I go in, I want to ask, did anyone try their hands at least to try and figure out further how we're going to accomplish certain things, or if there was any confusion from the last lesson, just briefly before we end, we continue. You can turn on your mics now and then I'll address any issues if there are. Hello, Godwin, are you there?
Please, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm asking, are there any concerns, any issues from the last lesson that you want us to clarify before we begin?
No, not yet. Not yet,
Okay.
please.
What about you, Hope? Hope? Okay. What about you, Simon? Simon, are you there?
and I'm okay. So we can proceed.
Okay.
I just tried to do something on my own, but I I I I wasn't able to figure it out. So
Okay. What about you, Jessica?
Hello, Bernard.
Yeah, Jessica.
Yes, please.
Any challenges? Any new insights?
Yes, a lot of insights.
Okay.
Yeah.
You get to share some.
Okay, so about the what we are trying to do, I was able to figure out the color, how to insert the color, and then how to insert the background image. I think the beginning I had a challenge with how to align or display the text, like how it appears on the image we are trying to design.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Okay. All right. That's good. Hello, Mr. William. Mr. Williams. Mr. William. You're welcome.
Thank you, Bernard.
All right. I was just asking. So we're going to continue where we left off the last time.
Yeah.
But then I want to find out if there were any issues, something you didn't understand, or any confusion that maybe you thought you figure out after, but then it still persisted. You want to share, so we can help you out with.
Yeah, so I was trying to continue from where we left,
Right.
setting up the web page to look like this, but I could only manage to do the background image,
Okay.
but how to align the nav I wasn't able to do it. I could only align it to the left, center, then back to the right, so I just left it. I couldn't manage any further.
All right. Okay. That's awesome. It seems some of us have pursued further, and then at least I think the challenges that I've heard so far will be rectified over here, but then at least you've moved further than I actually expected. So kudos to all of us. Yeah, so we're going to continue from today. We're going to style the nav bar. Angela, by the end of today, we should have styled the nav bar, made them inline like we have over here. And hopefully we can insert the background image. And if time is still there, we'll be able to include the text on the hero section like we said last time. All right, but hopefully by the end of this lesson, navbar and then the background image should be accomplished. Okay, so I'm going to go straight into my code. All of us can see my code. Okay, so I'm gonna open this in the browser. Excellent. So ideally, this is where we left off from the last time, right? So now the first thing is I'll start. Okay, so I'll start by trying to, let me see the design. Okay, good. So I'll start by trying to align the nav items on the same line as the one loop. Currently, they are vertical, right? And to do that, I'll simply go to my CSS, right? And to be able to align items side by side, right? HTML, the default structure for displaying items are block horizontal, right? So just like in our HTML, the way the items are listed, so you can see one loop before the list items. That's how they typically appear within the browser, right? So yeah, that's that. However, if you want to align that, place the items side by side, we need to make them in line, or there's an attribute called flexed, right? So make it placing them horizontally or align them side by side. You have to make them in line. And to make an item on the same line as another item, right? There's a display style called display flex. I mentioned earlier that by default, HTML items or elements are block styled, right? So they are vertical, placed on top of each other. You want to make them so their display is what display block by default. If you want to align them horizontally, then there's a CSS style called display, and the value is flex. So flex them horizontally or align them horizontally. So use the flex on the display. And to use the flex style, you first need to target the container that is containing the items that you want to align horizontally, right? So from our code, we can clearly see that the container that is actually holding the items that we want to put side by side is the nav, because it holds two items, the one loop text and the container that holds the list items, because they're separate from each other. I'll repeat that again. To apply a display flex, that is aligning items side by side each other, you first need to target the container that those items are placed within. And in our case, the container that holds the one loop text and the nav items, which is also another container on its own, is the special container called nav. So we need to apply the display flex on the nav to align them side by side. So I'll just go into my code. And like I said, I know that if I want to apply the flex, I need to target the container that holds the items that I want to align side by side. And like I said, by default, the display of HTML items is block vertically. But if you want to switch it up and make them horizontal, we apply the display flex to make them horizontal. And once that is done, you can clearly see that, let me just do this quickly so we see what we're talking about. So I'm just going to put a border around my element so at least we can see what we're dealing with. So I'll put a border around the P. And I'll put a border around this div. But I want to give it a unique identifier by giving it a class attribute. And I'll call it nav items. Great. I'll also give that selector, that unique identifier called nav items, its own class, its a style called for the border around it. And I could easily repeat the same dot nav items, right, and give it the same border 1px solid red. But because the same style, now in CSS, you can easily combine one style and apply it on two separate selectors, right? And to do that, first of all, the P element is what I want to give the border, both the P and the nav items. So I'll call the first element that I want to give the style, and then I'll bring my comma and include the second selector that I want to give the style, the same style. So it means that then this border of 1px solid red will affect the P selector and then the unique class identifier or called nav items. And we look into our browser, we'll see that the border red has been applied to both of them. Right. So you can see that the one loop, that's the P, is on one side, and then on the other side of it, horizontally, the nav items are also on the same line. However, because in our code, right, the two items that are inside the container we are trying to flex are just the one loop and this div. That is why the nav items are still vertically placed, right? And in this same case, I want to ask, so if you want to horizontally align this nav items, just like that we have in our design, just looking at our HTML, how do you think we'll approach it? Let me start calling names. Simon, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. All right. So I asked the question, right? That currently we've been able to place the one loop and then the div that contains the nav item side by side. Were you following when we were able to how we're able to accomplish this? Were you following?
Yes, please.
Good. So I just asked that if we want to, currently the nav items are still vertical, right? And they're not side by side each other. If we want to make them side by side, just like how we made the one loop and this div containing the nav item side by side, how would we make the services or the nav items, sorry, the nav items also side by side each other?
You can, please, you can call the next person. Let me be thinking about it.
Okay. Anyone want to pick this one up? How would we let the nav items display side by side each other? just like how we have the one loop and this div also displaying side by side. Anyone?
Hello.
Yes, Hope.
I think you just call the selector and then give it a display property and the value will be flex. I think that will be the answer, if I'm right.
Okay. All right. I mean, that's the way to look at it. But if you look closely, right? If you want to flex, okay, you know what? Let me call one more person and I'll come back to you. Anyone else want to try? Anyone? Okay. All right. Well, Hope, I mean, you have the right path of thinking, right? You just call the selector because ideally that is where the nav items are in. But you realize that within the selector, right, there's also a special kind of div that is holding the nav items. And if you're going to give this, you're going to call the selector the class called nav items and give a display flex on it. Nothing will happen because only one item is contained in the selector you want to call the display flex. If you want to flex items side by side, there must be two or more. But in this particular selector, it's just one item that is in there. Right? So I would, okay, so we have an item over here that already has display flex. So I probably don't want to repeat myself. So I would call the direct selector, right, that actually holds the nav items, which in this case is the UL. So I'll call that one because the UL contains more than one item. So display flex will work on it. So I'll call the UL and then apply the display flex on it, just like we applied for the nav. And that will make the nav items align side by side. Do you understand this?
All right, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So that's the first step. Now the next step is currently they are side by side each other. But however, the one loop and the nav items are still so close to each other in our browser. However, in the design, we can all see that the nav items are to the right or maybe the far right instead of being close to it. And to do that, we'll go back to our CSS. And
Hello.
inside our CSS, yes,
Please, we can't see. I can't see your browser.
what can you see now?
I can see now.
All right. Okay. So I mentioned that in the design, the one loop text and the nav items have some space in between them, or the nav items are to the far right of the one loop text, right? But in our browser, the one loop text and the nav items are sticking to each other. We want to shift the nav items to the far right, just like in our design, or create some space in between them. That's the one loop and the nav items. And to do that, we'll go back to our CSS, right? And apply another property that comes with display flex, right? That other property that comes with display flex that allows you to create a space in between those items that are being flexed or aligned side by side. It's called justify content. So you want to justify the content that are within the container that you want to space out. And the value for that is space between. And what space between does is, it will first of all check Space between, what space between that is, let me comment this out and show you something briefly. So you can see in our browser, right, it has created spacing in between the one loop text and the nav items. Now, what space between does is, it will first of all check for the width of the container. Excellent. It will first of all check the width of the container that you want to space or evenly space the content that the container contains. And let me see. Okay. Okay, good. Right. We will first of all check the width of the container that you want the spacing in between the items the container contains. So, so you see, I placed a border on the nav. The nav element is what contains the two items we want to align, or we want to space outside, align side by side and space out. So it will check the spacing in between. It will check the width, which is depicted by the red border around the container or the nav, right? And check the space it covers. Now, if justify content wasn't there and we just display flex when we were initially side by side, you can clearly see that there's still enough space from where the last nav item ends to the tip of the screen where my mouse is pointing right now. So what display flex that will do is, if you add justify content space between, it will then check for the spacing and check if there's still available space. Then once there's still available space, what will happen is it will now carry that space and put it in between those two items you want to space out. If it were 3 items, it will carry this space, divide it into 3, and space them in between those 3 items. If there were 4 items, it will carry the space, divide it into 4, and put that space in between them, and so on and so forth. That's what space between does. If there is no spacing, right, it will not place any space in between them. So, and justify content space between only happens when there is a display flex on the container that you want to space out. If there's no display flex, justify content space between or putting a space in between them will never happen or will never work. So at the back of your mind, always remember that if you want to first of all place items side by side, you put the display flex. And if you want to place a space in between the items that you have aligned side by side, you have to add justify content space between only if there's enough space to be placed in between them. And the way to check it is how I showed you. So it is carry the space that was at the end and put it in between them. However, let's look at our UL that contains the nav items or the links. Now, you can see that when I put a border around it, there's no space to even create enough spacing in between these items. So, first of all, if you put justify content space between, sorry, yes, over here we have justify content space between, just like we did on the nav. Ideally, you think it will work. However, when you look at our browser, there's still no space in between. That is because, like I mentioned, we'll first of all check how much width this guy is spanning. That's depicted by the red border. And check if there's any available space for me to carry and place in between the items that are in there individually. If there's no space, then there's no way I can assign space to it. That's justify content space between. There's no space to carry and place them in between the items. Now, CSS knows this. So it brought about a different style or a workaround called gap. Now, what gap does is it works like justify content space between. What gap does is if there's no or there isn't enough spacing to carry and put in between them, what it will do is it will force the spacing in between them by creating additional spaces equally in between them using the gap style. And it takes a unit in pixels. So we can apply, let's say, 10 pixels. And we'll apply equal spacing of 10 pixels in between the UR items or the nav items. As you can clearly see over here. The more you increase it, the more forced spacing it adds. Right. So the difference between justify content space between and gap, who can tell me that? Who can tell me the difference between justify content space between and gap? Anyone? My class people. Jessica, are you there?
Hello, please, I'm here.
Okay. Can you tell me the difference between justify content space between and the gap?
Okay, so the justify content, it
Mhm.
puts, if there are two contents in a box, it
Mhm.
puts a gap or a separation between the two contents, like say the one loop and then the nav items. There is a space, there are just two items, so there is a space between. If they were to be maybe nav item, the P item, and then another item, the justify content and the space between will put a space between these three items, whilst
Okay.
the gap is applied to just one item. The gap is applied on one item, let's say the nav items, it gives space in between the nav items. I don't know whether the gap can be applied on maybe a container or three items like how the justify contents did, but I know the gap is applied on just one item, whereby there is spacing in between those items.
All
Am I
right.
making sense?
Yeah. Anyone else? Yes, you are. You're right. But anyone else? But you missed a little bit. But I'll clarify that. Anyone else want to try?
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay. All right. So Jessica, yes, you are. I'll give you like 70%, 70 over 100, right? So you explained the display flex and justify content beautifully. However, you forgot to mention that for justify content space between, what it does is it automatically assigns spacing between the items that you want to apply the spacing in. Only when, let me do this. Only when there's available space for the spacing to be applied. So in our case for the nav, right, before we could apply justify content space between the one loop and the nav items, right? It will first check if there's any available space after the two items. And what justify content does is it will carry that space and put it in between them. That's for the two items. If there were three items, it will divide this space into two equal parts and place them in between the three items. If there were four items, it will check for the available space after the fourth item. If there's any available space, I'll divide that into three and place them in between the four items, and so on and so forth. So that's what space between does. It will first of all check for available space, carry that, and place them in between the items you want to apply that spacing in between. However, for gap, so you can see clearly, it lifted it up and place it in between. However, what gap does is but over here, there's no space after the last content. There's no available space. So applying justify content space between would not work because there's no available space for me to pick up and put in between them. So justify content space between will not work because there's no available space. I'm saying one more time. However, there's a workaround, which is the gap. And what gap does is it doesn't mind if there's space or not. It will forcefully apply spacing in between those items. So when you apply a gap in between items where there's no available space, it will forcefully put that spacing in between them. And that takes a unit. So when I say apply a gap, I know there's no available space for you to put the items, right? However, I want you to apply a gap, forcefully apply spacing in between them, which is the gap. And I want you to apply 10 pixels of gap in between them. So that way it forcefully applies the spacing in between them. Is that clear? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Good. So now we have our one loop and our nav items displayed side by side. Now, what you're going to do is, I'll give you some time to catch up. But what you're going to do now is to add the background image, right? But before I do that, I'll just open the floor for 3 minutes to answer any questions. Any questions, anyone? Any questions?
Yes, I've got a question for you, Bernard.
All right. Hello, William.
Yes, I don't know. Maybe for some reason I was left behind.
Okay.
My one loop and the other list items are not in line. Mine
This one.
is, yes, they are not in line. So mine, the list items is slightly under the one loop. I don't know if I missed something somewhere.
Okay. All right. Is your HTML structured this way? Can you see my VS Code?
Yes.
Check if to see if it's structured this way.
Okay. I don't have the class element.
Okay, but you have the nav, right? And
Yes,
inside the
I have the
you have
nav.
you have the one loop,
Yes.
and inside the one loop you have this div, right?
Yes.
Forget about the class items, but you have this div.
Yes, I have that one.
Good, and then you have the UL as well, right?
Yes.
Good, and then you have the list items.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay, good. All right. So in your CSS, right? When you apply the display flex on the nav, did it take the one loop and the services side by side?
The display phrase on the nav.
Yeah, just like this. So when you call the nav, did you apply display flex?
Yes, it's there.
Okay, and what happened?
So it's
Okay. Okay. Yeah, William.
yes, I've applied the display phrase and but it's this the services and the location are displayed right under the one loop.
Oh, I see.
They are not in line.
Okay. Can you I'm going to say share your screen, but you know what? Okay. What will happen is I have some time today after the call, so I might extend the class for us to properly analyze this.
Okay.
So yeah, so you can stay behind after the call and then we can go
Yeah,
over this.
I think I missed where you apply the border to both
Oh,
one loop and the other list items.
okay. All right. Don't worry. You after our like I said, you can stay on the call and then we can look at it. For
Okay.
anyone who wants to stay back, we'll just have time and then analyze each person's code. All right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. You're welcome. All right. So the next thing is I'm going to yes.
Yeah, please, I have a question. Can we go to
All right, Simon. Yes.
the stars here? Let me ask a question.
Simon, I can't hear you.
I'm saying that, okay, can we go to the star CSS on your VS
Okay.
Code?
Yes.
The nav element, we have where we have the justified content, the space in between. I want to ask a question that within the justified content space in between, instead of space in between, can we say space around? Or because there is no gap between the element, it will not work if we put space around. I just want to know if it will work out.
Okay. All right. So yes, you can put space around, right? And what space around does is, where was I? Good. So I just, in my code, I just changed the justify content space between to space around. And what space around does is, let me take it off and explain briefly. So you see this space after the content, after the contacts, right? Let me take away this gap. Simon, are you there? You see this space? Yeah, you see this space after the content. What will happen is if you apply justify content space around, it will then divide that space into 3 parts. Place one, 3 equal parts. Place one in between the two items you want to place the space, obviously, and then the other two will place them around the box. So we'll place them on the one on the left hand side and one on the right hand side. So when we apply justify content space around, it picked up that space that was there, divided into 3, right? Place one here, and the remainder in between.
Okay.
Do you get it?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, you're welcome. But actually, this even looks closer to the design than justify content space between. So Simon, thank you. I think we'll go with justify content space around. Thank you for that. Yes, and I'll bring my back up. Okay, yes. So this looks closer to the design. Yes. So great. The next bit is we are going to apply the background image, right? Behind the navbar and probably where this would be, right? So I told you that from the last session, I told you this section is called the hero section. It's pretty common in websites, right? For landing pages. So we have an application bar, and then we have the hero section, right? So I'm just quickly going to create the HTML for this before we apply the background in there. So what I'll do is I'll go back to my HTML, right? And from the design, I can see that the image is behind both the nav and then this text for the hero section, right? So obviously, the first thing that will come to my mind is, then it means that wherever I want to apply the background image to must contain the nav items, including the one loop and the hero section I just explained. Right, so I'm just going to create a section after the nav and put this text in there. Since 2017, one loop logistics. So I'm just going to copy this. Inside, I'm going to create a p tag for since 2017. I'm going to put an H1 for this text, paste it. Right, and then I'm going to copy this. We are dedicated the last text item. Paste it so that I have that in my HTML. Right. Good. All right. So now the next thing is now that I have the content that is relevant for me to apply the background image to, I will go back to my CSS and do some styling in there. Right. Great. So now it looks like in my browser, there is obviously we know how we arrived at this the spacing after the nav element that contains the one loop and then the nav items. Can't get to see Simon with a space around. That's very, very good observation, right? But however, it means that if I wanted to put spacing in between this, that means I have to go through that same route of doing display flex and then trying to put a spacing around it. But because I want to control the space for the entire for all the sections that are being displayed, that is the nav and then the hero section, I'm just quickly going to revert back to space between. So space between, right? So I'll be able to control the space I put on the side and on the side. So if it affects all the sections that are being displayed. The way I do this, I'll call my body, because my body is the one that contains every element in my HTML document that I see in the browser. So I want to apply some spacing on the left side and on the right side, so it's controlled for each section I keep adding. And to do that, like I said, I'll call my body because my body is the one that contains all the items in my HTML. And to apply spacing on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, which is inside my body, remember, I'll use padding. And padding from the last couple of sessions, we said padding is the style rule set that applies spacing in between, inside an element, sorry. So I'll call my padding, and because I want to apply it on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side, I'll call padding left. And on the left-hand side, apply, let's say 20 pixels. So it places some spacing on the left-hand side inside my body. And for the right-hand side, I'll apply the same pattern, right, of 20 pixels. And that will apply the same spacing on the right hand side. Great. So now the next thing is, where are we going to apply the background image? Looking at our design, it looks like the background image is in between, is behind the nav element, which contains the one loop and the nav items, and the hero section, which contains this text. So I'm going to go back to, with that same structure in mind, I'm going to go back to my CSS, in my HTML, sorry, and find which element contains my nav items or my nav elements and the section that contains the text. Directly, I can see that it is my header. My header contains two items, the nav and then the section. Okay. So I'm supposed to move this into the section. So yes, the nav and the section. The same way our design has the background image being inserted behind the nav and then the section. So I'm going to call this header in my CSS. Right, and apply the background. Now to apply a background image in your CSS behind an element, you call the background image style, and then you call the URL. And for the URL, you're going to indicate the path to where you can find the image you want to place. And from yesterday, remember very well, we placed our image inside the images folder. And where is the images folder? It's in the same place as our CSS folder. So what I'll do is, I'll call, because it's in the same place, I'll bring the full stop and the forward slash, call the images, and then call my sheet image. Right? However, before I'll do that, I want to see the box. Remember, I told you every element in HTML is a box. So to see what I'm dealing with, typically, I'll put a border around that element to see how wide or how tall that box is expanded. Now you can see over here, that background, the border of red is showing me the width and the height of that box. And the image is trying to be behind it. So you can see a portion of the image showing. I don't know if you guys notice it. Right, I just took out the image just to show you the box for the header, what we are dealing with, the width and the height. Now, if I bring back the image, right, you can see that the image is being applied, yes, on the nav and the hero section. However, just a portion of the image is being displayed. And that is because when we apply a background image to an element, it will only show on the width and the height that is being contained by that element. In this case, it is checking the width and height of the header. And so the width and then the height, and applying the image and showing only that part. That's how come we see it this way. Right? If we wanted the image to show fully, just like how we have over here, it's showing fully on, so we'll consider this our header. It's showing fully on our header. What will happen is I'll have to increase the height of the header. so that I can see the rest of the image. And to increase the height of my header, I'll call the number and then apply the unit. However, I'm going to teach you another unit of measurements of sorts in CSS. We've spoken about the pixels, right? That's commonly used. However, there are also responsive units. We call them responsive units. Responsive units means that based on something that is occurring on your screen, it will adjust accordingly. So, and those units are widely recommended and widely advised that we use to control how certain items will look based on different actions or things that are happening on your screen. And one of them is the viewport height, VH. VH means viewport height. And another one is viewport width, VW. This is VH, viewport height, the unit, and then VW, viewport width. So, like I mentioned earlier, these are responsive widths. These are responsive units. And what these units do is they check. So, for instance, for viewport height will apply a height to an element by checking the view of the device the user is using, right? And check where that's, in this case, it will check where our website is being displayed. And it will calculate from the very top where our border is touching. We'll calculate that view. Obviously, 100% of the viewport height means that on this screen or on my view, the height of whatever is being displayed on my screen is calculated from the very top here where my mouse is, where the border is starting, to the very bottom of where the view ends, where my mouse disappears. And that is by default 100% of that viewport. Viewport width, on the other hand, will calculate, if you give it, let's say 100%, it will calculate where the tip of where my mouse is, that's on the left-hand side, all the way to where my mouse has disappeared, just at the point where it disappeared, on the right-hand side. That's the viewport width. And remember, not all the screens you're using are the same height and width. They are different. So what viewport width will do is, based on the distance between, if it's width, the distance from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, it will calculate that and assign 100% of it. So 100% of my viewport height may be different from 100% of Jessica's viewport height, because our screens might have different widths and different heights. 100% of my viewport width will be different from maybe 100% of Hope's viewport width, based on the screens you are using, because they're different sizes. And that's what makes it responsive, because it's calculating based on your screen height and your screen width. That's different from pixels. Pixels are fixed and they're universal. So 10 pixels on my screen is the same as 10 pixels on Hope's screen, the same as 10 pixels on Jessica's screen, the same as 10 pixels on Godwin's screen. So it's fixed. But responsive is based on, like I said, our individual screens, and it will calculate based on that. And that's the recommended way. So because I want to make it responsive, right, I'll say 100% of the viewport height. So automatically calculate 100% of my viewport and align that. Because if I use a fixed unit, like let's say 500 pixels, maybe my 500 pixels would have been from the top to the end of my screen. But maybe on Jessica's screen, her screen size is shorter. So 100 wouldn't have been enough and would have overflown. But 100% of the viewport height, like I said, calculate is based on the screen that you have. Then now we can see that the image is coming to life. However, not every portion of the image is being shown. As you can see, I've opened my image over here, but I think what is showing is the sky. But we want the focus to be maybe this shape, right? So that brings me to a next style. By default, when we apply a background image to an element, it will only show the top part of it. Only the top part of it. But in our case, the top part is not our concern. Our concern is where the shape is showing. And we need to bring that into the picture. And to do that, we will apply another style called background position, right? And background position takes several values. It can take top, it can take bottom, it can take left, it can take right. By default, the background position of any element that you've applied a background image to is the top. So only show the top part. However, like I mentioned, we want the shape part to show, which is actually, if you look at it, it is within the center of this particular background or this image you're looking at. So the position I want to show will be this shape, which is in the center. So I'll tell my CSS, show me the center of my image, which contains a shape. Right? And then now we can see the shape. However, it still looks quite stretched. Right? And also, this white spacing that I added on the body is not making it look filled like we have over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to revert this padding on the body because it's placing spacing inside. And what I'll do is I'll go back to my HTML, right? And I'll call my header. My header that contains the one loop and the hero section. I'll call that and rather apply the padding to it. Padding left, 20 pixels. Padding right, 20 pixels. So that I've eliminated the white spacing that was coming with the body. And I'll apply the padding inside the header because we want everything of the background image to actually show without any white spacing. Now we want to correct how the image is showing over here, right? And what we'll do is there's another property that comes with the background. By default, the background size of any image we insert will cover the container that is being shown by default. However, there's another property, background size. This is by default cover, and that's what we saw. Going to contain. Let me see. Let me be sure of. Okay, my apologies. So by default, the size of the background that we see is typically auto, which is usually stretched. It comes stretched. However, there are two other ways of controlling how the background size should look. If you want it to look exactly how it came within the image, there are two of them. Either cover or contain. Now, when we applied cover, it was able to put the shape into perspective so we can see its entirety. But then there's another one called contain. And what contain does is it will actually contain the image such that it will fit within the container that it came with, right? However, typically when we use contain, it applies some spacing outside. I don't know if you can see my screen, but it looks like there's a duplicate image behind, if you can observe. So what happens is when you use contain, it will contain the image within the container it sits in. And what happens is typically it will apply some white spacing or some spacing on the side. And also by default, if you apply a background image, right, it will repeat the image to ensure that there's no white spacing or to cover for the white spacing. And to remove that image, that repetition, we call another background property called background repeat. And then we'll say no repeat. So you can see when I use contain, right, like I earlier mentioned, we'll apply some white spacing, which we don't want because it's trying to contain the image perfectly in the container it came with. And that comes with white spacing. However, if you don't want that, if you try that and that doesn't work for you, you can simply convert to cover or switch between the two to see which one works for you. For some people, contain might work with them. If you use contain and it doesn't come with a white spacing and it fits perfectly on your screen, then that works. However, if you use cover and it positions it this way, that also works for you. Some of you might not even use background size and background, what do you call it? Background repeat. You might just put your image in there and then you just use the background position to show which part of the image that you want in view. And that will also work for you. So you can just experiment with the background image, right? The height, and then now experiment the background position center. If it works for you, then that's perfect. Experiment, if it doesn't work for you, experiment with the background size cover. Switch between cover and contain and see which one works for you. If cover works for you, there's no need for you to bring background repeat. If cover doesn't work for you and you use background size contain and you see some white spacing, then then if cover doesn't work for you and you use background size contain and it works for you, then that's perfect. Great. So now we have the background image displaying nicely on our screen, right? So now my next bit is to change these colors. So according to our design, the color of the one loop and then the color of the nav items is white. So I'm just quickly going to, okay, yes, I defined them over here, the P and the nav items. I'm just quickly going to change the color. And to change the color of any element, especially text items, you just call the color property and give it the value that you want, which is color white. And it changes it. However, to change, you can see that our link items, right, and this H1 are not changing because obviously when we're applying the color, we apply the color to the H1 as well here, right? And the reason why the nav items didn't change is because by default, nav links or links within your HTML document come with their own default color, which is the default color for any text item is black in HTML. Now, if you move a step further, links also have their default color. So they have to override that black color and use that default color of purple, right? So when that happens, it means that we will have to override two colors, which is the black and then this default purple color. And to do that, I know that the HTML element that controls my links is the anchor tag. So I'll go into my code, call my anchor tag, right, and override that purple color. And when that happens, it will change that purple color to white. And now I want my H1 to also be white. So I remember I mentioned that if you want to combine 2 or 3 elements that have the same styling, you just use a comma separator between the selectors. So my nav items and my H1 have the same styling. So I just included the H1 to also have the same color. Then there we have it. Good. Now I can't even tell the difference. So now I can't tell the difference between my nav and my H1. So to tell the difference and show what I'm dealing and see what I'm dealing with, I'm going to put a border around my hero section to separate the two. Then now I can ensure that my hero section comes down in the middle, like we have in our design. All right. And to do that, I'll put a border around my hero my hero section. And I'm going to go back to my HTML and give my hero section an identifier, a unique identifier with a class called hero section. And then now I will go back to my CSS, call that hero section, and then apply that border on it so I know what I'm dealing with. Any other borders? Okay, good. So now my hero section is sticking or is directly under my nav items. But according to our design, there's some spacing between my hero section and then my nav items, right? Typically, there's some spacing on top of my hero section. There's some spacing on top of my hero section, right, from here to here. And so typically, as you can see over here, I've placed a box around my hero section, just like placing a box in my browser, like this. If I want to put spacing on top, which is outside this box, I'll use a margin. Margin is on top. A margin is outside the box. Padding is inside the box. So I'll use a margin outside and put it on top of this hero section. So I'll call a margin on my hero section. And which part of the what type of margin do I want to apply to my hero section? Where should the margin be? I want it on top. So I'll use a margin top, and then let's say I'll give it 50 pixels. That way, it pushes the hero section down. You can play around with the figures and increase them 70 pixels. So I push it further down. Right? And now I'll go back to my design. There's also some spacing on the right-hand side of the text of my hero section. And to apply that spacing, I could use two ways. I could apply either a pattern that's spacing inside this hero section or space outside it. Add some space outside it. You can go for either of them. Let's try both ways. So we can either use space outside this, which is margin. And which side do you want the margin to be applied to? If it was outside, it's on the left-hand side. So I can apply a margin of, let's say, margin. So that's my right-hand side. My bearings are wrong. So that's my right-hand side. So a margin right to the right, I'll give you, let's say, 70, the same 70 pixels. And see what happens. I can play around with it and increase it to, let's say, 150 pixels. And it's applying a margin to the right, which is outside this box. The second way is to use a padding, but then a padding will apply inside the box of the hero section. So I can easily change this to padding. That means apply spacing inside to the right of the hero section. And you realize that they accomplish the same feat, but this time the spacing is inside the box. Initially, when we use margin, we got the same outcome, but then the spacing was outside the box to the right. When we apply padding, now the same outcome, but this time the spacing is inside the box. Right. We can still continue experimenting, pushing until we get the desired design. So that one, I'll leave that one up to you guys to experiment with it. Okay. Good. And then one last thing is, okay, I think two last things. I'm going to change this color of the one loop to yellow and work on the font sizes. These are very small font sizes. Great. So for the two of them, or you know what, let me leave it as homework for you guys. Yes, I'll leave it as homework for you guys. At this point, I will pause for here for any questions or clarification. So yes, back to the class. Anyone with questions, clarification, something you don't understand, you want me to go back to in the code? Anyone? Okay. If no one, then I'm going to attend to those who had individual crisis. Then we can attend to you one by one. Just one second to the screen. Oh.